any questions that you have using the chat form. We'll be moderating the chat as we go along, but we'll also have a Q&A session at the end of our conversation as well. And if at any time you need technical help, please do not hesitate to contact us at support@bbbnp.org. Next slide. So before we forget, I do want to announce the CARU 2021 Annual Conference will be a virtual conference, obviously, held June 8th and 9th of 2021. So please write those dates down. I look forward to seeing everybody there, virtually, of course. I want to thank our sponsors who have been supportive of this entire venture for us since we went virtual back in April or May, and we thank them all for their support for the entire year and for supporting CARU and our mission. And those sponsors are Google, Hypershift, Keller and Heckman, Microsoft, Super Awesome, Venable, Manat, Baker Hostetler, and of course, last but not least, Davis and Gilbert. So I will turn the session over to our moderator, James Lee. Thanks, James.
Well, thank you, Donna. Sorry we can't see you, but it's good that we can hear you, and I know we're going to have a lively conversation. So briefly, I think, we probably know all of the panelists who are going to be the experts today, and that starting with Donna, who leads all of the privacy initiatives for the BBB National Programs, including the Children's Advertising Review Unit. So joining us also is Mary Engle. Mary is the new kid on the block at the BBB National Programs, having spent quite a bit of time at the Federal Trade Commission, including leading the advertising unit there. So it'll be very interesting to hear the insights that Mary has now, being on both sides of this coin, so to speak. And I'm James Lee. I am the least important person on this call. I am the Chief Operating Officer of the Identity Theft Resource Center, which is based in San Diego, and we deal in privacy, cybersecurity, and identity issues, primarily helping victims of identity crimes and compromises, and also advising businesses as well. So let's get into the meat of this conversation, and I'm going to start with Donna to sort of give us the historical perspective, because this session is, the past, present, and future. So a holiday theme here in a sense. So let's talk about how we got to where we are. So Donna, what was it like before we had CARU? It was 1974, I believe. So what was going on at the time?
So, in the early 70s, you had various consumer groups, along with the FTC, really beginning to increase regulation of advertising directed towards children. And I think under the threats of possible FTC crackdowns on commercials, unless advertisers were willing to do their own self-regulation themselves, the industry reacted by, urging our existing program, National Advertising Review Board and NAD, to kind of take a stand here and to step in. And in stepping in, we created the Children's Advertising Review Unit in 1974, which was funded by children's advertisers, major children's advertising, and established a special mandate to police child-directed advertising. I think it's fair to say that the initial efforts were met with some skepticism from various consumer groups, I believe. But there was a concern about a number of issues and whether industry could really self-police. And I think, clearly 1974, we're here in 2020, and think clearly we've proven that we have been able to do that. And I think so much so that the FTC now points to CARU as kind of, the cop on the beat, policing on the ground, and ensuring that our guidelines have a strong mandate across industry, and that we are creating some parameters and boundaries for children's advertising. And let's be specific about what we're talking about. We're talking about advertisements directed to those that are 12 and under. So that's on the advertising side. And, CARU has really two arms of what we do. It's advertising and the online privacy practices. And in 1996, CARU updated its guidelines to include provisions that would address the data collection practices of children in an online environment, specifically towards websites. And it was those initial guidelines that really created the foundation for what we now have as COPPA today. And in turn, the FTC approved CARU as the first approved COPPA safe harbor. So again, we've been in the COPPA space since the very beginning as a safe harbor since 2001, and continue to, I think, create an environment where we are helping companies really do the right thing, both on the advertising and privacy side. It was a chaotic environment, I think, before CARU came along, and I think that we try our best to work with industry. Right now, we are undergoing an update and review of the advertising guidelines. We've made a decision to separate the guidelines. If you went online today and downloaded our guidelines, you'd see one document that includes both advertising and privacy. And in light of the upcoming FTC review, rule review of COPPA, we've decided to separate because we anticipate, obviously, us needing to update our privacy guidelines align with whatever the amended COPPA rule will be. And the process for doing that, I think, is very different than our advertising guidelines, where we're working closely with industry. I think this is a great example of how self-regulation should work and does work. And there are expectations from Capitol Hill and from the FTC that CARU continues to have strong guidelines, strong mandates, but we're also cognizant of the implementation efforts and what it all means for advertisers and influencers and things like that. So we have to move our guidelines forward. We have to move beyond what the Children's Television Act originally mandated. We have to move into the 21st century. So that's what we're attempting and hoping to accomplish. So I think prior to CARU, there was no specific entity really policing this environment, and now we have this effort by CARU to continue to police this effort. So I think we're in a much better place than we were, in 1974.
Yeah. That's a great level set for everybody. I'm gonna throw you a curveball here, though. It may not be much of one, but I want to throw you one. In this country, we tend to legislate and regulate by anecdote. What specifically was going on that finally people said, okay, enough's enough? We have to have some sort of order to the chaos.
I mean, I don't know what specific, if there was one specific case. I think that there were a lot of things going on with regards to the advertising, the amount of advertising that was directed to children during TV screening time. I think there was a lot of issues, and we know that this because it grew, out of CARU grew CFBI, or Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, because of issues with children's diet and obesity and consumption of food and things like that. So I think the consumption of advertising, what was directed to kids, how often kids were seeing it, regulating it just during what was considered to be children's screen time, which has now, I think, gone into flux, right? Because children no longer watch linear television. So I think defining what's children's time now is becoming a complex issue for us. So I think it was really a matter of what were children being exposed to, how often were they being exposed to, and how do we police that?
Okay, that's great.
And I'll just jump in, and if I can, I think in the early 70s, there was a lot of concern about all of the kind of sugary foods that were being advertised to kids, as sugary cereals and the like. And the FTC embarked on a very ill-fated rulemaking to address that. But I think the creation of CARU was part of the effort for, okay, let's put some rules of the road here.
As a child, by definition, under the law at that time, I can tell you, yes, there was a lot of sugary foods being consumed. Mary, bringing you formally into the conversation now, from your perspective, in particular, we have a history of 46 years now of this effort, both on the advertising side and the privacy side. What in your view has worked well in that time frame?
Yeah, so I think this idea of having a unit that's focused, and not just focused, but who exists to look at children's advertising and now children's privacy issues, it doesn't have a different mission, is really important. And I think it's interesting to think of that, CARU was originally kind of a unit, so to speak, of the NAD, but now it's separate. But the idea that you would have people who are focused on that, who become experts in children's advertising and children's privacy, who aren't distracted by having to look or consider other types of advertising issues. And I say that as someone who was at the FTC for 30 years and had children's advertising among the many types of advertising that we had to consider. It's nice to have a core group of people who are just dedicated to one issue and do become experts. And I also think what's worked well is, CARU's ability to address not just issues of what might be deceptive or misleading to children, but also what's appropriate or not appropriate, to take a step beyond where the law can go and think about in a broader, say, more ethical way of how we should be advertising to kids and not just what we are legally able to do.
And here's your curveball. That's fundamentally different than the way we approach adult privacy and adult advertising. Is we don't take a view of harm or impact. Is that the real differentiator between how we regulate and self-regulate in these kinds of issues of related to advertising and privacy? Is that we are concerned about the harm for children?
I would beg to differ a little bit, because I think we do consider harm. With adults, it's just different. Adults are considered much more able to protect themselves against harm. So maybe the requirement or demonstration of harm is harder than with kids, where we have an understanding that they are vulnerable, that they are not fully cognitively developed. They don't have the same kind of cognitive guards against that, that ads aren't necessarily telling you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? That they're biased, they're trying to sell you a product, they may not give all the information you need, that there's this persuasive intent, there's all that stuff that we recognize is true for children, and children need extra protections from. So I think it's not just, whether there's harm, but understanding that there is much more likely to be harm if it's not done right.
Okay, that's fair. That's very fair. Okay, that's the where we were. Now let's get to where we are, wherever that is. So Donna, when we building on that last little conversation there, are the impacts of advertising and children, and by default their privacy, and the risks so very different today? And we know the media landscape is different, but are the things we're trying to prevent, are they really that different?
So let's segment this into advertising and privacy, right? So on the advertising side, I would argue that the impacts and risks aren't that different. I think, someone said to me some time ago that the brain of a 5-year-old child today in 2020 is the same as the brain of a 5-year-old in 1974, right? The way the brain progresses, the way a child learns, that is not substantially different. What's different is what we put in front of them and what they have access to. So I think in 1974, you would see the same thing that you see in 2020, which is a child tugging on their parents' pants in a store, begging them to buy them something because they saw an ad on television or they saw an ad on YouTube, right? It's the same type of reaction that you're going to get. But I think what has increased over time is obviously the access, how children are seeing things, how often they're seeing things, right? Again, back to my point that they're not just seeing it during children's time on linear television. If they're consuming most of their media and content on a platform like YouTube, that's 24/7. at that point, it's up to the parents to really shut it down. And for the child to have some sort of screen time limitations, all that sort of stuff. But I think the increase of risks are there because of the increased exposure. It's not necessarily what's being advertised anymore that's any more risky. It's the exposure. And I think you segue that into the privacy aspect of it, the ability to collect data and information about children. That's a new thing for us. That's new in the 20th century, right? That didn't exist back in 1974. The ability to collect data from an advertising perspective, from a privacy perspective, that risk obviously is a new risk that we're still working through, trying to identify how that all works, right? As technology progresses, the ability to collect more data, whether it's personally identifiable information or anonymous data, determining what's what and what the risks are, and how children identify those risks. So we have these conversations, among staff about, what a 6-year-old understands versus what a 12-year-old understands are two different things. And I think we recognize that. The law has decided, at least from a privacy perspective, that under 12, we're going to treat you all the same. We can talk ad nauseum, and Mary and I just had this conversation earlier this week. We could talk ad nauseum about whether or not that should be what it looks like, right? Should we be segmenting it even more so, maybe based on media buys, right? If it's segmented to 6 to 8, 9 to 11, maybe those are the age groupings that we should be looking at. I'm not proposing that, so don't let anybody put in the comments that that's what our guidelines should say. That's not a proposal. That's just not, we're not editing our guidelines here. But for the purpose of this conversation, I do think that it's important to recognize that we have made a decision, legislatively at least, that that's how we're going to treat children, and that we need to continue to identify what those risks are. So I think that now the short answer to your question is things have changed. Especially on the privacy side. I think on advertising, again, it goes back to exposure, not necessarily content, but exposure.
This is, again, here's your next curveball, because it prompted. I'll tell you what prompted this is I'm thinking about my own kids and how they deal with their kids, so my grandkids, and trying to do everything from control their screen time, which is not even possible right now. But also, right. My grandsons, my oldest grandson, who is 6, his greatest ambition in life right now is he wants his own YouTube channel, and because of what he sees and what he's exposed to through that, and my kids try to manage that. What though is the role of parents in this environment and in this regulatory framework? How do we bring them in? Do we bring them in? How does the regulatory framework anticipate that? Other than just saying 12 and under, okay, that's one thing. 12 and older, you're on your own. What's how does that play into this evolving environment we're talking about? So
the caveat here in my answer is that I am not a parent. I don't have children, so please don't attack me for my answer of not being a parent. I have a young niece and nephew that I've been trying to manage in an online environment. But I think that there's been a lack of education, in my opinion, from the FTC and from legislators about what this all means, right? And I don't mean just for parents, I mean for businesses as well. I think that we as an entire ecosystem need to do a better job of educating parents and businesses about what this all means and what the impacts are. That being said, I think that parents have many opportunities along the way as their children are going online to start making these teachable moments, right? The same way that you teach your child in an offline environment to do certain things. You don't talk to strangers, you don't take candy from strangers, all these sorts of things, these rules of the road that we teach kids offline. You need to be teaching your kids how to behave in an online environment as well. And that starts at a very young age. It starts probably as soon as they get access, right? Is it 4, is it 5, is it 6, whatever it is. But I think that parents of today's generation, next generation, these understands that teaching your kids how to behave in an online environment is not very different than teaching them how to behave in an offline environment. It's a very simple rule, right? Do you act in a way online that you would never act offline? And I say this to adult friends, like, do you post something that if your employer saw it, if your mother saw it, would you want people to see it? it's not difficult to kind of set these rules, right? But we're not having these real conversations, and it's difficult for parents to have these conversations if they don't understand really not just what the law says, but why it says what it says, right? What are the risks? What's happening? Teaching them about the basics of technology and being able to access geolocation on a phone. What does that all mean? So I think we have a long way to go, and I think educating the entire ecosystem. But I think parents would be remiss to not take these opportunities and turn them around into teachable moments for their children.
Thank you. That's yeah. I think your niece and nephew are in good hands. Mary, let's build on that. Do we have the tools and infrastructure we need now, or do we need to look at different kinds of paradigms? Because anybody can launch a channel now, and that certainly blurs the line between what's an ad and what's content. So do we have the tools we need?
I mean, I think there's a couple of issues on the table, right? The issues Donna was addressing in terms of, say, parental controls, and there are lots of parental controls built into devices that parents need to know how to learn to use and know that they're there. But on this issue of the ease of content creation, if your six-year-old grandson, were to create a YouTube channel, the idea that you have this proliferation of content creators, do we have the tools to address that? And I would say, to the extent that you have sponsored user-generated content, where CARU is fairly well equipped. I mean, certainly well equipped with linear television, traditional television, and with online. But I think the sheer number, the kind of volume of sponsored user-generated content, and obviously there's lots of user-generated content that's not sponsored. That's not something that's advertising that CARU would be concerned about. But where you have brands reaching out to content creators and paying them or incentivizing them or giving them free product to help promote, then the brands, I think this is really an opportunity for advertisers, for brands and their agencies to step up and make sure that the content creators they're working with understand that there are rules of the road, what those rules of the road are, and that they play in accordance with them. And so I think this is thinking about the huge amount of content that's out there. We have the infrastructure, but this is really an opportunity for the brands to step up to the plate, because otherwise it's, the volume is just going to be too great.
I'm going to play timekeeper for just a second, and that is we're about 30 minutes from the end of our conversation. So if anybody has a question, you can go ahead and submit it now. We'll answer it later, or if it's just something you've got, you're just dying to ask and you need an answer right now, just kind of flag that in the comment you make over in the chat forum. This is for both of you, and I'll let you arm wrestle for who wants to answer first. But if we were drawing the line today between self-regulation and government regulation, would we draw it in the same place?
That's a good question, and I'm looking at Mary because I may defer to her first, but I'll take a stab at it, Mary.
Right.
I think we likely would draw the line in the same place. I think the conversation. Look, I'm still learning and still curious about why 12, why 13, right? And more so even more curious about it now because of the ongoing proposals on the state level to raise the age. So what's happening now that wasn't happening 20 years ago, at least in the privacy space that we're talking about raising the age? And I could take a really good guess about what's happening. But is the answer raising the age of COPPA? I'm not sure that's the answer. I'm not sure we've done everything we need to do with the regulations that we already have in place. And again, this goes back to partly due to the lack of education, right? Have we done everything we need to do to exhaust this to make sure that everyone's getting it right? So I'm not sure I would move the line.
Very fair.
I'll defer to Mary.
What you think, Mary?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think there are hard lines to draw, and any line is going to seem arbitrary, but it has to be drawn. But I'm pretty comfortable where the lines are right now. The First Amendment dictates a lot of what the government is going to do. So so the government can only go so far in terms of regulating speech, even commercial speech directed to kids. And so that, it's going to go so far, and that creates an opportunity for self-regulation, I think, and an obligation really on marketers who are considering things like corporate social responsibility to step up to the plate and kind of guide their actions by what is the right thing to do and not just what they're legally able to do. So I think, and even though CARU was created before all of the First Amendment protections were recognized by the Supreme Court for commercial speech, I think it's, things are pretty much in the right place, and in terms of what the government does and what CARU and self-regulation can do.
So I'll add to that I think what would be beneficial to self-regulation, look, we have support from the FTC, we have support from Capitol Hill with regards to self-regulation for the most part, I think. Industry really needs to step up, right? But for industry volunteering to adhere to self-regulatory guidelines, government will step in. So it behooves industry to really be involved and to get on board. And we want to work with industry on trying to figure out where should we draw the line in self-regulation, right? What should these parameters look like? What should the boundaries be? Because self-regulation is constantly trying to prove itself to regulators that this works, right? That we are self-policing in a way that's impactful and effective and taking into consideration the protections we need to make, at least with regards to children. So the more engagement, the more involvement we have of industry, and today industry means not just the advertisers, the commercial companies, but influencers, right? Everyone who's touching this ecosystem needs to be involved and pull a seat up to the table.
Well, and that is the perfect segue into the next section, because we've talked about where we were, we talked about where we are now, where we're going. And I would argue that in the world of self-regulation in general, this is probably one of the most successful forms of self-regulation, particularly because of the relationship between the FTC and the trust that's with the BBB National Programs. This works really, really well, and it's a good model for others to follow. But we have seen in this year, in virtually every parts of society, massive changes. Some good, some not so good, I'm sure. We'll see over time. For example, we're in the middle of the holiday shopping season. We've advanced 10 years in terms of online transactions just since November. So we're seeing, a massive shift all related to the pandemic. We see kids now with screen time, which was unimaginable. Parents were already trying to reduce screen time. We're trying to diversify things beyond just sitting in front of a screen all day. And now what do they have to do? They have to sit in front of a screen all day. Mary, when you look through the lens of your experience and what is under consideration now at the BBB and other places, what do you see as what we need to do next, and who do you see as needing to be involved? Because all the parties who have been at the table, we may need new parties at the table going forward. So what do we need to be doing now to prepare for all of these changes, some of which are going to be permanent going forward?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. I think as you mentioned, parents were already sort of losing the battle to limit their kids' screen time beforehand. I think I've seen estimates that this is pre-COVID, kids would spend 7 hours a day consuming media. So now it's got to be more. And I think that genie is out of the bottle. I think that even after, knock on wood, COVID, the pandemic is over and we can go back to meeting in person and kids go back to school in person. It's going to be impossible, really, to significantly get kids to limit their screen time. I mean, I think it's just changing the way people react, and also I think, you know, maybe more of a recognition. It's not screen time per se. It's like what you're doing, what's on those screens, and I think it's really going to be incumbent on all of the stakeholders. It's parents, other caregivers, teachers, policymakers, doctors. You know, we all have a role to play here in figuring out the path forward. And, you know, thinking about it, you know, Donna, I think, mentioned earlier the Children's Television Act and the kind of traditional regulations that FCC has around traditional children's television or linear television. And those were put in place to protect children from too much advertising, from inappropriate advertising, from advertising that was blur the distinction between entertainment and advertising. Things like limiting the numbers of minutes per hour of commercials, bumpers between shows and advertising, no host selling and the like. And so I think we're at a point now where we need to think about, are those values we still hold? And if so, how do we implement them in today's digital environment? And I think this is a real opportunity for businesses to step, and children's advertisers in particular, to step up to the plate and figure out how to apply, if those are principles we hold dear, and some of them is sort of legal in terms of not blurring the distinction between entertainment and advertising, but how do we adapt those notions to today's digital world, to streaming content, when we know now kids are going to be exposed to so much content online and digitally, so much more advertising. What is the right way to address that? So it's not just a matter of not being deceptive and misleading kids, but how to protect them and nurture them and have them grow up in a sound and healthy media environment. And, you know, I think Donna had mentioned we're in the process of updating the CARU advertising guidelines. I see that as a real opportunity for us to think about these issues and be on the vanguard of it. And advertisers who know this media environment much better than regulators say, have an opportunity to figure this out and come up with appropriate guardrails.
Donna, I know you have a thought, so.
No, I mean, Mary said it quite succinctly. I think that the opportunities exist holistically across the board. I mean, I'm not sure how kids go backwards, right? They've spent almost an entire year in front of screens in a way that, you know, many parents and many schools never intended to happen. But this is where we're at, and how do we deal with this moving forward? How do we not lose kids in all of this, right? How does schools, once we do get back to schools, how do you retrain kids to be in a classroom, right? I mean, it's just like, I've seen adults having a difficult time adjusting to being with people in a public space because they've been behind their closed doors for so long, right? So we as adults are trying to navigate this. How are children going to do it? It's going to be very challenging. But we have a role to play in that, and as an industry, and I think we just need to just keep looking forward and being as forward-thinking as possible, which sometimes is difficult because technology seems to move faster than many of us can move or react to.
Very, very true. The sort of last area I want to explore here is we've talked about most of these things in context of the federal government, the FTC. Increasingly, though, particularly in privacy, it's the states that are passing laws. I'm not sure of any, you guys will clearly know this, but I'm not aware of any that are really looking at a self-regulation model, though it certainly exists at a state level. We had the CCPA, California Consumer Protection Act, and now in a couple of years, we'll have the CPRA based on the vote in November, where the voters here in California approved a new ballot initiative that will be even more restrictive. And those laws have specific provisions that deal with children and children's privacy. Is that in any way a model that is going to proliferate, or have we kind of got, California did it, so that's, the rest of us don't have to, or we'll see more of this? And if we do, should there be more of a self-regulatory effort to try to head off some of these state laws?
So the states are what keep me up at night, quite frankly, because I never know what I'm going to wake up to the next day. California, typically where California goes, the country goes, but there are a lot of states who are making proposals in similar areas with regards to regulating advertising and privacy, putting in some privacy frameworks for children under 16, under 17, and that's part of the issue, right? What's a child? What's an adult? We know COPPA has set a bar with 12 and under. So we know teens are start at 13. Where does it end? Is it 16? Is it 17? Is it 18? I don't know. This is why BBB National Programs is launching, a new self-regulatory program called TAP, the Teenage Privacy Program, to really address that specific teen space, which I would argue is possibly more vulnerable than the under 13 space, in part because of the economic buying power that age group has that the under 13 doesn't have. The states it's a patchwork, and what we don't want to see is a patchwork. Businesses have enough challenges complying with one state law, right? And if you're going to say right now California is the high bar, then everyone's just companies I think are just going to say, well, we'll apply that across the board. And in some ways you have to, right? You have to presume that either one user or all users are from California and treat them all like that. But it's challenging, and I think this is where self-regulation can help, because what concerns me is that when they are legislating these laws, I don't hear a real robust conversation about not just implementation, but the cost of implementation, right? The cost of complying with these laws is astronomical. Even for those companies who may be making hand over fist money, the costs are astronomical. And who do those costs get passed down to, right? It gets passed down ultimately to the users at some point. Those conversations don't seem to be happening to the point where I'm comfortable, right? I would consider myself a true consumer. I mean, I consume media. I consume content. If I'm traveling somewhere, there better be a 55-inch plus screen in that room somewhere, because otherwise I can't engage. I like media. I like content. I'm consuming all day. I can't imagine not having access. So I can't imagine being 15 and not being able to do certain things and getting access. When we want something, we want something. It's the nature of who we are. But I'm very concerned about the challenges that face businesses. So as a consumer, I have my wants and needs, but I think I'm hypersensitive to what businesses need to do in order to continue to create really great content, right? Most of these businesses that we are dealing with at BBB National Programs and in CARU, these are good actors. They want to do the right thing, and they just need guidance on what is that right thing? And the hope is that, CARU can help them figure out what the right thing is, but let's not stand in the way of really robust content, really great, fun stuff, and allowing companies to really achieve their end goals, right? if we don't have the real conversations about implementation and costs associated with it, you're already putting in barriers. And now you're causing more of a rift between industry and government. And if we all want, if the goal is to protect children, if that's the underlying goal, the fact that we can't all agree on how to get there is problematic. We should all be able to agree on that.
Mary, you have anything you want to add to that? And from your perspective as a federal regulator?
You know, I think not on the privacy side specifically, except for I do think that it seems likely that in the new administration you're going to see more activity. Probably, you know, whether it's federal or whether it's coming from Capitol Hill or coming from the FTC or the FCC even. I would not be surprised at all to see more concerns coming to the fore about protecting children online, particularly. And it's a bipartisan concern as well. And you've seen that with some of the legislative proposals that have come out. This is not either party. I think there's concern across the board that the digital media environment right now is kind of the wild, wild west. And there needs to be some guardrails in place. So as I said earlier, I think this is an opportunity for responsible businesses to step up to the plate and put some self-imposed guardrails up there before it's done for them, and do it in a thoughtful way, you know, that makes sense and is appropriate for the environment.
All right, we have come to the point where we're about to start the Q&A. So if you have a question, look for the chat function and the chat form and type in your question, and we'll put that to our two experts here. In the meantime, while people are typing furiously, this is your chance for a last word each. So we'll start with you, Mary. You know, any final thoughts before we wrap up with questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of expanding a little bit on what I was just saying, I think that, you know, I've seen a number of the proposed bills that have come out of the Hill where, yes, sometimes it's COPPA related or type things, or privacy, expanding the COPPA age higher. And I think we probably all agree that it's not appropriate to teach. And it would be completely unworkable to treat a 16-year-old like a 10-year-old. But we've seen other initiatives looking at certain advertising techniques. They're concerned about things like autoplay settings or push alerts and in-app purchases. And we've seen proposals to ban in-app purchases completely. A whole host of initiatives that you understand that they're well-intentioned. And I think it would make sense for us to consider, okay, what are the concerns here and the harms? And is there something we can do on a self-regulatory basis to address them in a way that makes more sense, that does, you know, really acknowledge what the issues are, but works well for technology, and as Donna said, also to support the robust kind of content that kids want, and you know, companies are able to deliver.
Great. It almost prompts another question. I may come back to it. Donna, last words before questions.
So, you know, I think that what I find most interesting, not just about this conversation, but I think about the functions of CARU and how over the years we've gone from these very siloed environments of advertising and privacy, right? All the advertising stuff was just handled separately. All the privacy stuff was handled separately. And now there is this clear convergence among the two, right? Oftentimes companies are finding themselves in trouble on the privacy side because of data collections happening on the advertising side. And I think we need to be more holistic in how we're approaching these types of things, especially when it comes to children. And that's what I think makes my job very interesting. I think that's what keeps us all having these conversations, even as we're going through the advertising guidelines. I think in the back of our minds is, what does this mean from an implementation standpoint? If we're creating barriers or frameworks here and boundaries here, what is the impact here, and what does it look like holistically for the child's experience, right? Whether it's on linear television, whether it's on a platform like YouTube, whether it's in a mobile app, what does that entire experience look like? And what's our role in helping it be something that is not onerous, that is not sending the child down the wrong path? And again, I think part of what we're fortunate to be able to do at BBB National Programs is work with companies who really do want to do the right thing. They want to achieve their end goals. But self-regulation has a huge role in this, and I think that we need to figure out what that all looks like, because we're going to be constantly dealing with, as Mary said, I think this administration is going to be rather aggressive, especially in the privacy space where the past administration has not been. So we need to brace ourselves for that. And I think one of the challenges that I personally always find myself dealing with is reading the news and trying to figure out, well, where is this going? How do we get ahead of this? Right now, I feel like we spend so much time playing catch up, and then when we feel caught up, a week later, we're not anymore. So how do we remain forward thinking in our approach? And we work with companies who are doing so many innovative things. So in that innovation, which we want to support and we want to be a part of that innovation. In that innovation, what questions should we be asking? Let's take a step back and just really think long and hard about what that looks like from a consumer experience, what that looks like when a regulator looks at it, right? Optics are everything when you're dealing with regulators, right? Your intentions may be one thing. What it looks like optically, whole different, and we've got to deal with the optics. So I think this administration may prove some challenges for us, which I welcome, but I think they'll also ask some questions that we may not be asking that we need to, and hopefully, guide our approach.
Thank you. Those are two great closing soliloquies there. We're almost out of time, period, but based on our Q&A time, got one thing for you. It is a common exercise, particularly in for-profit businesses, to look at not just what I'm doing and what I need to do, but what am I doing today that I can stop? Because that gives me bandwidth to do more in terms of change or enhancing things I need to be doing. Are there parts of our both regulatory and self-regulatory schemes that we really don't need anymore? Ha!
That's a good question. You did. You did. I'm looking at Mary's face, and she has the same look on. I have the same look on my face. That's a good question. That's a good question. And I don't have an answer for Mary.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question. It's definitely, we were not pre-prepared for that question.
Winner.
Exactly. Mission accomplished, James.
Stumped us. Nothing is leaping to mind. I would be interested to know what others think about that. Not that whoever's watching would need to necessarily weigh in, but I wondered, like, and I mentioned earlier, like just the idea of whether the values that underlie the FCC regulations, are they still values that we share? Because if they are, then we need to adapt them to the digital environment. If they're not, then things could look very different. that would mean that we could stop caring about how much advertising children are exposed to. I'm not saying that we stop caring. Just like be clear about that. But that it is, if we do care about that still, then we've got to be doing things that we're not doing.
Well, I'll say.
So
more.
I
Oh,
think.
go ahead, Donna. I was going to rescue you, but go ahead.
No, I think that, what we've discovered this year is with the pandemic is how companies are forced to scale back, right? To look at their bandwidth, look at their resources that they have. Some companies have unfortunately, faced more trying times than others. How do we, simplify things for them, knowing that they have limited resources now? And I'm not sure that that's going to end in 2021 even, right? I'm not sure that that's going to even end just beyond a vaccine and us going back to some semblance of normalcy. But it's something that I think we need to be sensitive to.
Great point. Well, and my rescue statement was going to be, the wonderful thing about both of your answers to this is nothing springs to mind, which means we really do have an appropriate level of regulation and self-regulation. What we have is working. Because if you could immediately say, oh, gosh, we're doing things that we don't need to be doing, then we're out of sync. But that's not the case. Well, I appreciate both of you and your comments, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and create a little bit of stress for you there at the very end. And I know that there are a couple of housekeeping items that follow this, so I will be quiet now. And again, thanks to both of you for your thoughtful comments, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for moderating this conversation for us today, James and Mary. I really appreciate you doing this with me. On the screen right now, you'll see some information about our Teenage Privacy Program. As I mentioned earlier, it is a new self-regulatory program, obviously targeting the teenage space. We are hoping to convene meetings soon with companies that are interested in joining us. So please reach out to me if you have any interest in becoming a member. I think we have one last slide. Yes, again, a reminder about the CARU 2021 conference, which will be held June 8th and 9th. So please put the date down, save the dates, and we look forward to sending you more information as we put the agenda together and the event together. So I want to thank everybody both in front of the scenes and behind the scenes. This was our last CARU conference session for 2020. I appreciate everybody tuning in and supporting us along the way, both our sponsors as well as our attendees. I hope that you found these conferences helpful and informative and fun, and we had fun doing it. So I wish everybody happy holidays. I wish everyone to be safe and healthy and sane, and we will see you in 2021. And again, thank you, Mary, and thank you, James.
Thank you.
Thanks, Donna.